All right, everyone. Welcome once again to the Faces of Business. I'm your host, Damon Pistolka, and I'm excited for our guest today because we are going to be talking about economic incentive procurement and explaining what that is to people, how we do it, when it's important. But we've got none other than repeat offender Josh Malancuk here today from JM Tax Advocates. Thanks for being here today, Josh.
Well, thanks for having me, Damon. This is a great opportunity, and always enjoy the experience working with you.
Oh man, it's going to be fun today because as we were talking before we got on, it's happened to me once when we go in and building a greenfield site or something. But these economic incentives and procuring those incentives, can you just explain what we're talking about first of all, so we can clear that up with the listeners and everybody knows what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so the general concept is many states have developed economic policies to incentivize or induce growth with employment and with capital investments to help kind of spur their economy. And so normally there's legislation that kind of authorize certain items that would incentivize a business, such as abating property taxes for a period of time for the capital growth that occurs in a jurisdiction, or maybe incentivizing jobs through income tax credits or other grant programs that kind of help push the project over the edge in that jurisdiction to ultimately go forward. And so really, a lot of the states compete for these projects because they're really good things, right? I mean, it's great to grow the economy. All of these states want to grow. And so by offering these incentives, ultimately they'll compete between one state to the other with a winner and a loser for the project. And so in essence, these states are buying jobs through offering these incentive programs for businesses to grow in various spots and maybe in certain cities within a state as well to coincide with economic policies with each state.
Yeah.
So to a business, it can mean a tremendous benefit to help offset, what can be a pretty large investment for the company, maybe historic levels. And so,
Mm-hmm.
if you're growing your capital, if you can offset that by 5 to 20%, which is kind of our benchmark average when we get involved with procurement, well, you've not only made a dent in your hand there, but you've probably set that business up for continued profitability to establish that as a lower site from a competitive nature with your other facilities as well. So it's a great tool to help, really with some genuine support needs to get the labor force up and running and to get the capital in place without having to see immediate operating costs or property taxes or other expenses while the business is ramping up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool just to think about it. If you're doing an expansion with a business, you're going into a new area and you're considering 2 or 3 areas, that could make a lot of difference if one could have certain kind of, like you said, property tax, income tax, job benefit, the creation of benefits or to help to create those jobs or train those people, just all those kind of things could make a big difference. That's for sure. So when you're thinking about this, what are some trigger points like, this might be a good time to think about it. Maybe not so much. But what are there some guidelines to go, well, if you're going to do maybe this big or this much land or whatever, what are the kind of things that really set this apart?
Well, so, when you're looking at growing little as 10 new jobs in a jurisdiction, that should trigger at least some research about available incentives. Another trigger point has other sites out of state and is potentially going to shutter an operation and move those jobs. Well, the receiving state will actually consider those jobs as new jobs with respect to incentives. And so, it's important to kind of plan ahead for those types of events. Growing capital by as little as $3 million can also generate some incentives that might be available. But so generally growing your jobs, growing your capital, but the most important aspect of this, Damon, is that there's a planning element that is extremely important because there's a concept called a but-for provision with most states, which means, but for the incentives, you wouldn't have grown in that state or that county or that city. And so that is kind of a perceived concept that's extremely important with respect to negotiating incentives. Because if you go in and you say, well, I'm going to grow here, what incentive is there for that locale to offer you incentives? It's kind of a basic concept. Yeah. So maintaining that is extremely important. But to get more specific, before you ever file any external disclosure forms like sales permits, land acquisition documents, closing on the land, any sort of media announcements about growing into a certain spot, any sort of construction permitting, any sort of kind of communication with a local economic development planner, as I mentioned, saying, hey, I'm going to grow here. What can you do for me? Those types of communications will literally squash your ability to procure incentives in that jurisdiction unless they have just flat out cash grants that they offer without any sort of inducement concept, which is kind of rare. And they're usually smallish type incentives. But basically you've disqualified that business at that point with any of those events by probably 95% of what could be available, maybe 100%.
So I just want to back up on this because this is a pretty big point that really they only want to give the incentives to people that are businesses, organizations that are actually going to need them. So you really need to demonstrate that need by not going out and buying land or buildings or committing to expanding into an area until you've talked to people about incentives to allow you to do that.
That's right. But then there's also several more steps that have to be completed before those items as well. So it's not just letting the cat out of the bag as far as external filings or communications. There's actually several steps, and some of those may require public hearings to demonstrate approval for the incentives. Some of that may involve legal agreements that are signed and agreed to up front prior to any of those construction activities. And certainly you don't want to start digging dirt and having girders stick up out of the ground when you're trying to say that, hey, you got to give me incentives to build here. Well, I actually it's funny that I mentioned that because my first incentive project, my client failed to tell me that they were under construction before a public hearing to ask for a tax abatement. And sure enough, there were girders sticking up out of the ground. And one of the council members knew, I was kind of young in tooth and experienced in this area. And they were really respectful. They were like, son, do you realize your client's already building the building? So you might want to go talk with them about that because, there's a problem here. And I didn't know enough about what that meant and why that was so important. But I found out in a hurry why it was. And so, that business by just going ahead with the construction without the formal vote with the council jeopardized their entire incentive request. And it was a tough learning lesson for them. But unfortunately, I learned the hard way based upon their inexperience and their failure to plan properly to allow ample time for these public hearings to take place.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something. So I know there's a lot of stuff I want to get to about the different types of incentives and those kind of things, but you bring up a great point. Okay, so now I'll just say we're going to go into this area. We think it's probably big enough to start talking. What's the process that you actually go through? I mean, if just big steps to go, hey, you should do this first, do this second, do this third kind of thing, because, some people may be out there right now listening to this going, we're ready to expand. We're going to go into Louisiana or wherever it's at, and we're going to build. We know we're going to build. We know where we want to go, and they could be missing out on a lot of incentives if they get down there and, like you said, they open an office, get ready to do that construction. And then they think, oh, wow, now let's see if we can get any incentives because we didn't think about that before. So if you could kind of lay out the steps, just the big steps would be kind of helpful. So someone listening could go, I need to start talking to somebody then.
Yeah. So I would say that the research and diligence is different. The work plan is different when you've got site alternatives for the project that would involve possibly a new facility from scratch facility, or a large renovation project that, again, could have alternatives between sites. And so when you're looking at various sites and you are looking at a build, I mean, you want to look at what the labor force looks like. How much unemployment do you have that could actually staff up the jobs at this factory? Because the last thing you want to do is build a factory and not have enough labor force in a community that just has a small population, or maybe that population is almost 100% employed, and it's an aging population that is not likely to produce enough young people to run the factory or whatever the project may look like. But labor force is important to evaluate. The costs with the labor force, your logistics with freight and how that is looking, and in relation to your major customers. And so there's a lot that goes into studying the area to first make sure that it makes good business sense to build in a certain spot. But let's say, for instance, you already have a facility, you've already made the good faith leap that you want to be there, you already have jobs there, you're already established, right? And you're planning to expand, and maybe you've got another plant in another state that's kind of fighting for the same project. Well, you still want to look at the labor force trends, but then you also want to look at, what are the incentive programs in each particular state, and how do the property tax rates, for instance, compare, one versus the other. And so there's kind of this decision tree that happens to not only line up the incentives, but also line up the business factors that could, kind of tip the scales with that decision, one site versus the other. So that site selection diligence is really key, so that you don't have a surprise coming down the pike where you've made all this investment and now you're literally not finding enough people to man the lines and work at your factory. So that's extremely important. But then as far as the incentives go, once you've kind of gotten a good idea of viable alternatives, what we'll do is we'll kind of go through an incentive negotiation with each of the site economic development folks and procure a competitive package of incentives, again, for both locations, and then use that to kind of negotiate one versus the other with maximizing the deal, bringing that competitive pressure with site alternatives. And so in some cases, it's by statute to prove that you've got a competitive site to gain access to incentives. So, that alternative type diligence is extremely important, really, to do the best job that you can. And there's a lot of labor time and meetings and diligence involved with that. Most of the time, our clients don't have the time to do all of that, and they wouldn't know the first place to start with looking at alternative sites and procuring incentives in multiple jurisdictions like we do. So that's an important concept. But once you kind of line up an initial offering, there are also some steps to actually formalize the agreement in place, which may involve public hearings, kind of some back and forth negotiation, agreements that can be very lengthy, possibly with a lot of legal language. There can be steps for once the agreements are inked, to go through and actually comply annually with possibly some complicated surveys that have to be submitted every year. Because that's the thing. Once you negotiate the right to an incentive, you still have to comply with your incentive agreement in terms of proving out that you're doing your end of the deal with growing your jobs or capital based upon your initial commitments as a company. And so if you're not demonstrating that annually, you could literally either lose the entire incentive altogether or lose it for that year. So the annual compliance is extremely key. And then also from time to time, just with any government employee, you come upon situations where there's maybe an error interpretation of the agreement that can happen at the state or local level. And so you got to know that you got the benefit that you negotiated. So that certification review, looking over either the assessor or the economic development agent at the state, and making sure that their computed amounts are accurate. Extremely important. You can't assume that you got your money, because you know what happens when you assume it. You can really be taken advantage of as a company. So keeping the government accountable in all phases of this is extremely key. Even if they're the friendliest bunch in the world, seem like they're just willing to give you the world and help every way that they can. When the agreements are inked, when the annual compliance police come out, usually there's a different sort of thought process and that's important to kind of keep in mind, so you don't have some surprises with lower benefits at the end of the day.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, because it's something, talking with you now, it's a point that I hadn't even thought about, is that two things. One, it's an incentive for you to lose. First of all, it's not just given to you as good. You got to be, and the second point is, even if you think you're doing it, you think you've proven you're doing it, that you need to make sure that the person that's going to say, yes, you are doing this, is really using the right data, their calculations are right, or whatever you're going through there, to ensure that they may just be wrong as well if they turned you down or said it wasn't really like you said it was in the beginning.
That's exactly right. There's a lot of fine print elements to this, Damon, and so there's the surprise factor is pretty high, and I don't want to start a conspiracy theory, but in some cases it kind of looks to me like it's rigged for failure, and so that's where a seasoned navigator like us can kind of play the movie forward and see where it's going, and then take steps to avoid having an issue or a surprise going forward. Or if there's an issue, we're capable of going to bat as an advocate for our client to set the record straight, right? And so that's where we earn our fees, and then some, by making sure that the deal got sealed, our client actually got the money that we negotiated for them, and everything is working according to plan. And then even more importantly, our client is having that accountability to get their information together so that we're meeting the compliance deadlines for those surveys, because if they miss that, then there could be a real problem with either a single year of benefit or maybe the entire benefit altogether, because of the way that the incentive agreement was written. And so again, just being able to avoid those pitfalls before someone stumbles is extremely valuable. And
Yeah.
and that's kind of how we earn our stripes as incentive consultants.
Yeah. Wow. So much to think about in this. So, what are some of the trends? Have things changed a lot over the last few years, or are they really kind of staying the same? Or what are some differences, things that you're seeing now, if there are some, with these incentives and how people are approaching them and what types of incentives are being given?
Well, taking a big step back. So first of all, when you're negotiating incentives and you're researching available incentives, you have to know your client's business, and you also have to know
Mm,
what incentives could even be usable to them. So for instance, if they're not subject to corporate level state income taxes, certain incentives won't be of any value
yep.
whatsoever, right? So knowing whether it's a refundable credit, or if it's not, and the carry forward activity that would be available for that deduction is extremely important. So that's all part of the initial diligence, but
Yeah.
negotiating usable incentives is a real key area that I failed to mention at the beginning as well.
Yeah.
But as far as the trends go, really this all centers around the current state of workforce in the United States. And folks that are maybe staying at home or have retired too early, it's created this huge ripple effect with available workers in the United States. And that is really impacting our way of life as Americans. But as a company that's so labor reliant, that worker shortage has really been a big challenge to businesses, especially labor intensive businesses like manufacturers. And so if you don't have enough people that are willing to apply and work in your factory, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And there's a number of different responses. I mean, employers have gotten creative with allowing work from home, for some of the administrative support folks, and that's a good thing, as long as your workers are working at home
Mm-hmm.
and only working for you, because
Yeah.
sometimes you find out they're working for two employers.
Yeah.
and so that's a big deal. Another is, there's such a shortage with the unskilled labor tier that many manufacturers are resorting to automation and replacing those jobs with machines. And so in order to do that, they have to upskill their existing employees to learn how to use the automation equipment and maintain it. And so finding maintenance employees for those factory machines can be a real bear. So there's kind of a trend and a shortage for repair technicians. The folks that are baby boomers that are retiring, is creating gaps with employees, and so it's all kind of converging at the absolute wrong time when we've had way too many government entitlements handed out, and folks are making more just staying at home versus coming back to work. And so, there's a lot of different factors that create this problem where you're going to your favorite restaurant and you're waiting for 2 hours for your meal to come to you, and it's just because there's not enough people to work in the jobs
Mm-hmm.
that at one time had plenty of people, and so the workforce element is probably bar none the biggest issue that our companies in the United States are challenged with and are having to deal with, and so that's kind of one trend. The other is having to deal with insourcing the factories. In other words, moving factories from foreign countries to the United States because of logistical supply chain issues. So supply chain is another big issue that's creating a lot of movement and capital growth in the United States. But again, if you don't have the people that are willing to work, what good is it to grow? So that's kind of the push and pull that's creating, I think, opportunities to look at incentives, because there are retention incentives that can be available to help employers get to the next level with automation, and also kind of move their workforce into that higher paying, higher value added type job situation. And so training and upskilling employees is a paramount importance with every state in the United States. And so there's a lot of programs that are out there these days to help with training through grants, cash grant matches. But you just have to know where and how to apply and when as a business. But then, those programs can literally fund up to 50% of your training budget year after year. And so that's just an example of an incentive that's out there that's being used to kind of help drive good economic policy to build skills in a state workforce to improve the economy. And so those are big trends. And the workforce shortage trend is also having a profound impact. But then many states are kind of seeing this as an opportunity to help fund those automation efforts through some kind of retention incentive programs to partially fund some of the automation equipment purchases. So you just have to know the message and how to ask for those and where to look. But those programs are out there. But again, it's important to, before you actually buy the equipment, before you dig dirt and start the construction project, you have to think about these incentives and go through all of the hoops to make sure that you're free and clear to build, construct, and add jobs under that umbrella of a formalized agreement well before all of those key events happen.
Yeah, so you really need to be talking to the local economic development people, understanding this before you may have done an initial site selection or review and said, okay, looks like we got workforce, looks like the logistics are going to be okay, but now it's time for us to really see if this and the incentives, the whole package works for us. It's just like another wheel in the package, isn't it?
That's true. And the planning element can't be understated. And so when a client comes to us and says, hey, I'm going to grow, here's kind of what I'm thinking, this is why it's important to me strategically. The next question I ask, well, when are you thinking about growing? And, because you need to give me at least 6 to 9 months to do my job for you so that we're not in such a rush because of your construction timeline that we can actually negotiate the incentives and maximize the deal. Because if we have enough time, we might as much as double the economic benefit for the incentive offering because of that competitive pressure that, we've had enough time to build as part of a multi-site negotiation and competitive negotiation between the sites.
Yeah. How many times when you do this, and I'm looking at 3 different sites and you go, wow, the incentives are way different across the board, or do you usually go, they're pretty much the same, or because not knowing this, and what do you see when you do that?
Well, some states are more similar to others, and others are vastly different, and some states don't even offer incentives.
Okay.
So if you say I'm going to grow in California or Florida, my next comment is don't bother.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to get anything there, right?
Yeah.
So knowing the state that you're possibly going to look at expanding in or move to is really key. So that state is really an important thing to know.
Okay.
What your realistic alternatives are.
Yes. Well, that just brings up the next question, and you don't have to, we're not going to take you, to the bank on this, but what are some of the better states that you've worked with that really understand the incentives and how to make them work for the companies?
Well, I really feel like most of the Midwest states really get the concept of economic incentives, and also the Southeast, with the exception of Florida.
Yeah.
Get out west, Texas is a very business friendly state in general for incentives, but then there's other states that just are not,
Yeah.
and so, but I really like the Midwest and the Southeast, and the South in general, for incentives, and so,
Yeah.
in a lot of cases, they offer a much easier, more streamlined process for negotiating and applying for the incentives. Because if it takes you a year and a half to finally get your incentive,
Yeah.
well, I mean, you've already moved past your construction inception phase, and it doesn't you no good.
Yeah.
So having a state, I'll just pick on Indiana, for instance. Indiana is a great state. They get it from a standpoint of making things streamlined and user friendly to businesses.
Yeah.
And so the application process, I find, is extremely short. It's expedited with decisions, and the incentives as a whole are pretty easy to use to a business. So I like Indiana in that aspect. What I don't like about Indiana is that we tax business equipment, which I think is a competitive disadvantage. And with other states that surround Indiana, like Illinois and Ohio, for instance, that don't tax business equipment, that's a disadvantage, just because of the property tax structure. And so, looking at the property tax structure is key, to know kind of what you're starting with, and what's going to benefit the company, and whether you're starting with a tax type that doesn't exist between certain states.
Yeah. Yeah. So really understanding your states before you even think about going there might be a good thing about incentives, is just go, okay, here's where we're kind of thinking. And I'm not even talking about, we've looked at the workforce, we've looked at anything, maybe if you're going to need incentives, or not, I shouldn't say, because you really should need them to get them all the way through. But knowing that your state's going to be harder or may have some better ones that fit you is important before you even approach a state.
Absolutely. And then, as far as site selection, I mean, knowing what, the utility rates are and how those compare, whether there's available land to even construct the project, because, if you're ready to go, you need shovel ready land now. You better know that you've got land that has utility hookups that shovel, right? And if you don't, and you got to wait a year for a big transformer to be constructed by the utility company, that's going to be a big drawback. So those are things you look at as part of your site diligence, and knowing kind of what's happening with energy, namely, do you have brownouts, that you're going to have to deal with? Do you have a good, dependable energy system in that state? Is extremely important, especially to a manufacturer that is so energy dependent.
Oh, it's huge. You can ruin millions of dollars of equipment with those kind of situations.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that don't get fixed easy too. so you're out of commission for a long time.
That's right.
Yeah. Good stuff. Well, when you're, where so going back up a little bit, workforce in manufacturing, we hear it all the time. That it is, you couldn't hire the people. Someone said this, and I don't even know it's true. With all the openings in manufacturing, you couldn't hire the people because there's not enough unemployed people. Don't know if that's true, but how many times are you seeing this now, looking at the multiple sites and going, hey, workforce just not even it's going to discount us from 2/3 of the sites we're looking at, or 25%, or how many times is the workforce just it's going to stop us from even getting started?
It is a huge part of the decision.
Wow.
And I think that the workforce is really creating somewhat of a economic blight to this country, and I think if we solve that issue with sound leadership and concepts at the state and federal level, we'll have a lot more economic prosperity than even we've seen over the past few years, right? And so the problem is, long term, it's going to really bite us, because what happens, in many cases, is that the companies, when they run out of workforce and there's not enough dependable workforce in a particular area, they'll just pick up shop and move to either a spot that does in the United States or just out of the country altogether. And so, so having companies move out of the country is a big risk, especially for manufacturers that are so labor dependent. That's why you hear about jobs going to Mexico and other foreign countries like China, because we just don't have enough people that are willing to work in this country to man all of these job openings. And there's a number of reasons for that, but I think it really starts with, what are we doing with the high schoolers to kind of shepherd them into better paying positions, in manufacturing, and seeing that as a viable career path, or offering, kind of vocational programs to help move people through, so that they're working for the first time, versus hanging out at Starbucks as a barista for a few years right out of high school. I mean, those programs really can be powerful and beneficial for companies that want to put some intellectual capital into folks that have zero experience, and then kind of bring them up through the system. So I've seen situations where some of my manufacturing clients, I'll pick on a HVAC group, they'll actually offer on-site training with the HVAC production simulator, and the folks that pass muster there will actually get jobs on the line, and the same is true with HVAC repair. I've seen that with fits, they'll offer a vocational education path for free, and then the folks that qualify will actually get the first job offers. And so that's kind of bringing people up through the system, through the vocation, through internships. Internships are a really powerful way to build experience, with the inexperienced kind of next young employee. And we actually use that program, and Indiana actually offers some wonderful sponsorship through what's called the EARN program, where the state will actually fund half of the internship through a cash match for employers like us that will see fit to bring interns in and show them the ropes and build some skills. So those are just examples of where the worker skill building programs are working well, but we still got a lot of growth to do to shore up the gap. And there's way too many people retiring with all of those skills intact, and so it's going to be a big challenge to replace the aging workforce with the next generation of young employees.
Yeah, and we've talked to a lot of people. Kurt Anderson and I, and on our Monday and Friday show, it's manufacturing e-commerce. I mean, we talked to a lot of people, and getting the young people aware that manufacturing is even an option. And I think a lot of that comes from an older generation or their parents that may have been in manufacturing, may have had a solid career in manufacturing, but for some reason don't want their children to live the same life that they did, even though if they look back at it, manufacturing is not a bad career move at all, because of both the horizontal movement and the upward mobility that you have within these companies once you get some experience right out of high school. And that's just a huge thing. And I love what you talk about with the vocational schools, because we all talk about four-year colleges. You hear that all the time, blah, 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 blah. But that's not for everybody. and some of these kids can go learn automation, learn electronics of some sort, learn how to run a CNC mill or weld or whatever the right thing is for them, and then turn and go into those manufacturing companies. And these are wages that they will not see working at the retail center, at the mall, at anything else. I don't care how long you work there.
Right.
That they just won't see. And they won't see the other thing that I see in this. And hey, if you're a retail person, that's awesome. Do your thing. But retail hours are not that great compared to a manufacturing position usually. And there's just a lot of things. And I think that this is great to hear about the vocational, the internships. You look at some of the countries in Europe, Germany, and other ones that have long history of internships and developing these skills early in people. We have to solve the workforce problem somehow. And I don't think we can automate fast enough.
Right.
And it's not cutting out jobs. I just don't think we can automate fast enough to cover the retirement. So that's really for us the only way to get enough people to do what we need to do.
That's right. And you may ask, well, gosh, we started with incentives, but we went to this workforce type phenomenon. Well, to kind of tie this together, while you're doing what you need to do as an employer to grow and upskill your workforce and respond with investing in capital to help deal with some of the worker issues, there's incentives that can be available.
Yes.
If you just plan ahead and take those steps to qualify each of those initiatives for the myriad of state or local programs.
Yeah.
So what it ends up doing is helping you with that extra level of support to take on those activities that can really impact your business from a strategy perspective. Mm-hmm. And instead of overpaying the government with a lot of property taxes on that new capital, or a lot of state income taxes on the withholdings for your employees and the like, part of that can come back to you to help fund that growth and make your dollar move a lot farther while you're growing. And let's be frank about this. Your competitor is doing this if they're smart, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you do it to stay competitive with your competitor? And so it just makes good business sense to think about economic incentives and to plan ahead so that you can actually secure usable incentives that make sense for the company with the greatest possible benefit.
Yeah.
And then now you're able to fund, your training programs. You're able to fund that automation that literally keeps that plant running and keeps it competitive with your plant in Malaysia. And now you're able to, add the extra person in your accounting department that you otherwise wouldn't be able to help make sure that your financial transparency is there for your stakeholders. And, all of this kind of ends up mounding up to be a really big deal for companies. And it's not uncommon for us to negotiate 8-digit type incentives.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you get into a project where, you can negotiate a $12 to $15 million incentive program for a business. And that can be the net operating income for a decent sized company, on an annual basis. So these incentives can be worth a lot, but you just have to allow for the time and the process to play out the right way to make sure that you're getting every opportunity and making full opportunity to sell your project and secure those incentives.
Yeah. Wow. This is great learning more about this with you, Josh. It's just, I think a lot of companies don't, well, I know they don't look at it the way you're looking at it and have the experience that and bringing the experience to, and really the timing and the process to be able to the best way possible look at our alternatives for expansion, and then consider what the local governments can help us do, or the state or federal government there, and in some cases can help us to really make it the best investment for all of us possible. So
That's right.
thanks for stopping by today and explaining about this economic incentive procurement and some of the things that you're seeing. And I just want to say that listeners, if you got in this late, go back to the beginning and listen to this, because this is, as Josh just said, some of these things are 8-figure incentive packages. If you're going to go in with a large expansion or something else in a new area, and then just the importance of site diligence and really understanding where is the best site, including incentives, including workforce, including logistics, and some of the other things that you mentioned there. So, wow. Thanks for sharing with us today, Josh.
Well, thanks, Damon. And if I would just leave one carrot, nugget of gold to the listener today, I would just say, don't go it alone. So if you as the company are going in and negotiating for the company for these incentives, you've already lost, because the site, economic develop director, they'll know that you're gonna expand, and so you've lost your bargaining power. Bring in someone that can be your experienced navigator who can negotiate with anonymity and through a non-disclosure type forum, to where you as the business aren't even mentioned with the initial discussion. And so the seasoned navigator, bringing in someone that can kind of steer through the process and knows the state, knows the incentive structure, knows how to negotiate the usable incentives, and knows your business and kind of what's important to the business.
Yeah.
Those are real key elements. But it's important to know that there are folks out there like us that will earn their fee 10 times over through what they're able to bring back in terms of benefits. And so don't go at it alone, because your pocketbook will thank you in the end. Trust me.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Josh, thanks for being here today. If people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to get a hold of you, Josh?
Yeah, so the best way to get a hold of me would be first email, Joshua@JM Tax Advocates. If you forget that, www.jmtaxadvocates.com has a contact us part of the website. Good. And then my direct dial number is 317-674-8390, and I'm at extension 100. Feel free to leave me a message. I'll give you a call right back.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for being here today. Thanks for all those listeners we have. And thanks again, Josh, for explaining to us some of the different considerations with economic incentive procurement, site selection, site diligence, and workforce. Wow. Thank you.
Thanks, Damon. We're here to help.
All right. Well, hang out with me just for a second, Josh. We're going to shut down. Thanks everyone for listening. We will be back again next week.